Hi, and welcome to APUSH History Lesson 9, A Revolution Concluded. Our previous lesson, Lesson 8, dealt with the actual unfolding of the American Revolution as a military conflict. This lesson will deal largely with the prosecution of the war, the end of the war, and then the aftermath of the war in many ways. And to start with this process, then, we can look at the war as a military event. Events had taken on a life of their own, which meant that the colonials were engaged in a shooting war with the British as they were trying to build their military along the way and build their institutions of government on the way. This has been compared to trying to build an airplane as you fly it, with some of the inherent challenges and risks that would be involved in that process. In the war, it had about 3 phases. You've got a war that takes place initially as Washington is assembling his armies in the upstate New York area around New York City, Pennsylvania, Trenton, in this northern area here, which is separate and away from New England. You've got a second phase of the war that then involves, actually the separate phase is involving the upstate New York, with conflict sort of moving towards the Canadian border at Saratoga and a little bit inland towards Lake Ontario. And the third and final phase of the war, which involves conflict in the entire South. The British are going to try 3 different punches, 3 different strategies to achieve their end. Their initial strategy is they're going to land at the port of New York. Their idea is to slice up the Hudson River, slicing off the cancerous New England from the rest of the colonies before any infection of revolution and treason can get into those other colonies. Washington obliges them initially and fights some traditional stand and fight battles. In New York, Philadelphia, loses in both of those regions very significantly. However, in each instance, he's able to preserve his force and leave the area. And this is so critical to the colonial strategy. Washington's best attribute in many ways is that he was a very skillful and effective retreater. He would have liked to have fought the British on the British terms, but there was no way with his untrained army that he was going to be able to do that and survive. As long as the Continental Army exists, the conflict will continue to exist. The dream, the revolution will still exist. Without it, there'll be nothing. And Washington realizes his most important job is to run away. His most important job is to preserve and husband and caretake that army, because it's the one thing that will stand between revolution and no revolution. So he learns these hard lessons those first couple years. In the meantime, the British try to put into place a complex plan with a 3-pronged attack to slice along the Hudson River, to slice New England away from the remainder of the colonies. They fail at the Battle of Saratoga, which winds up being one of the prongs is left on its own. A British general is forced in the middle of the wilderness out in upstate New York to have to surrender. Remember, we discussed, or you've probably learned on your own, a key British strategy, or a key American strategy, was to draw the British into the interior, away from the coast. At Saratoga, a British force is surrounded, cut off, and has no other choice but to surrender. And in so doing, provides America with their first significant victory of the Revolution. At this time, the French, for their part, the Kingdom of France, decides to engage in a formal alliance with the United States. And here is where, in many ways, the American Revolution is like England's Vietnam. Vietnam had the support of powerful external benefactors, specifically the Red Chinese and the Soviets. We had the support of the French and later on the Spanish and the Dutch, the Netherlands, in our fight against the British, and there were some very straightforward reasons for this. The word we talked about in some of these previous lessons, realpolitik with a K. What does that reference? It references pursuing a foreign policy ruthlessly dedicated to one's own self-interests. From the French point of view, remember the French, they're run by an absolute monarch. They have no use within their governmental state for democracy whatsoever. That's completely antithetical to the way their regime runs. But what they do have a use for is anything that's bad for their arch rival, Britain. So in the realpolitik sense, the enemy of my enemy is also my friend. Do you follow that? The enemy of my enemy is also my friend. The Americans and the French, 2 completely different governmental ways of life, could strike common cause in the fact that whatever was bad for them was good for them or good for them. So the French are more than willing, particularly after being evicted during the 7 Years' War and thrown out of the continent entirely, losing their empire, they're more than willing to return the favor and provide that same kind of service for the British to see them lose their empire as well. So we see this take place, and then the war in the South, the final phase, is a dual conflict. The war in the South turns into an extremely ugly internal civil war between Tories or Loyalists and Patriots, along with the British being in it. And the British are horrified in many ways by the atrocities that the Tories wind up perpetrating. The British head south, hoping to use the Tory supporters there to build a base from which they can roll northward, almost like a window shade, roll up the continent and roll up the rebellion. And so they placed Tories in position of authority, not realizing that by doing so, these Tories were then, in many instances, going to use this as an opportunity to settle old scores. And so you had all kinds of internal, very bloody, messy fighting where men, women, children, old people, young people, neutral people that weren't picking a side even, were all getting killed in this process. And this raping and pillaging of the colonials that either were found or that was done doesn't, in the long run, actually endear any of them to British imperial government, because for those who were loyalists, the British are unable to protect them. For those who weren't loyalists, who were on the fence, every atrocity is further proof, whether it's loyalist or the British who committed, it's lumped in with the British. It's further proof that this government's arbitrary, despotic, tyrannical, evil, and it has to go. And so as such, the colonials wind up fighting a war of winning by not losing. And this gets into the war's end and the Treaty of Paris, which is soon to conclude it. British frustrations were with having to play essentially a never-ending game of chase. They could never actually track down the colonials because they always outran them in all their theaters of war, and they could never actually pin them down and fight them in a conventional battle for any length of time. And when they won battles through superior weight of numbers, it didn't matter. For the British, it was almost like trying to take a fork and stick it into a piece of Jell-O. You know, you could stick it in, but it would just kind of slime up and slide right through it. The revolution slid right through their hands. Wherever they went, they were dominant. As soon as they left, behind them the vacuum was refilled by patriots and the neutral population who were increasingly being drawn into the patriot camp. So the British were essentially never able to win the hearts and minds of the colonists. So even though they won every major battle, they won every major victory, these victories didn't get them anywhere. And in the end, after being cut off at Yorktown and having to be forced to surrender, the British have now lost two armies. Their first great army up at Saratoga, and now their second great army here at Yorktown. The British, after this 9-year conflict, also like the Vietnam War or the Iraq or Afghanistan affairs, the length of the conflict both makes it very expensive for the British, but also exhausts the patience of their people in many ways. And the British seek a diplomatic solution. This diplomatic solution will then be the Treaty of Paris of 1783. As soon as the war had begun, Americans had been trying to negotiate and work with England to secure a peace. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay were the primary negotiators, or John Adams rather, were the primary negotiators. And the French, for their part, wouldn't mind if the war went on forever, because anything that could bleed England white was good for them. So ultimately, Franklin and Adams have to independently sign their agreement to end this conflict. And so the terms of peace wind up having about 5 parts to them. First of all, we gain formal recognition. The Mississippi River becomes the western boundary of the United States. We gain fishing rights off Newfoundland, the Canadian coast that we would have sought so much. The British promised to evacuate their posts in the Great Lakes. They don't fulfill this promise right away, but they promise to in the Great Lakes region, the modern-day states of Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And we're going to honor and pay all of our pre-war debts, and we're going to restore Loyalist property. The colonials promise we'll restore Loyalist property for all the damage that's been done to it. We don't ever exactly do that. So there's parts of this treaty that actually don't get laid out and played out until later on. Now, periodically, multiple choice questions show up on the exam that involve maps. And just for a sense of context of what happened when and where, they'll ask you to put something in order, say this map reflects the US when or something along those lines. There's a map I want to show you. To introduce the original United States. We'll come back to this one in other lessons, but notice the borders, the boundaries of the original United States. As per the Treaty of Paris, 1783, we are bordered by what? Spanish Florida to the south, the Mississippi River to the west, the Great Lakes to the north, and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. Okay? Florida, Atlantic, Great Lakes, Mississippi. That is the original full territorial extent of the United States of America. So that's the original nation we're referencing and talking about during this time period. Now, not only were we building the airplanes we were flying it in terms of creating this national government, this continental army on the fly, kind of working through things, we were also establishing state governments. The states were going from being colonies to being states. And that involved a whole lot of transition. Some of their colonial charters had a lot of things that they wanted to use. Some charters had been obviously revoked because colonies were placed under Crown law. Some colonies decided they needed to modify their existing charters because they reflected too much the English imperial model. And so a lot of changes had to take place to and within this model.